Welcome to roundhillradio, the podcast from Round Hill Community Church. Through our conversations, we discover the holy in the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we're talking about when we talk about faith. This summer, while Ed is on sabbatical, we are diving into the archives. Over our last 7 seasons, we have explored a rich variety of topics and themes, and we're excited to share some of these with you again. Today, we're visiting an episode from June of 2021. Ed and I discuss the book When the Heart Waits by Sue Monk Kidd. Her words are full of wisdom, poise, and grace, and will encourage us along our spiritual journey towards becoming who we truly want to be. Enjoy.
Welcome back, everybody. We're so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in with us. Today, we are talking about the book When the Heart Waits by Sue Monk Kidd, who was author of The Secret Life of Bees, which was very popular for quite a long time. Ed, what drew you to this book in particular? I know you are a voracious reader, but what brought you to this book in particular?
Well, it's interesting because I do love to read, but I found it really hard to read during the pandemic. Like my whole approach to that, it became such a grind. That was really alarming, by the way, for someone who really likes to read and suddenly you can't even think, like books are piling up, but zero is happening with them. So earlier in the year, I read with a small group of people a book by Karen Armstrong called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. We did some work on that on our podcast. And I was looking for a follow-up to it. And for some reason, Sue Monk Kidd's name came to me because her story is more personal. It's not really grappling with a big theme in terms of compassion. It's dealing with her big life issue, which is a woman coming into a midlife crisis. So I had read this book many years ago. In fact, it was written in 1990, and I read it with a book group back in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
So there's a little bit of history as far as that goes. But one of the things I remembered about the book is that she was coming into a crisis point in her life. And she had to figure out how she was going to move through that. I thought, well, we've been through quite a crisis in these last 16 months or so. And for some people living in that time, as obviously for many people, it's been a horrific time. For almost everybody, it's been a huge challenge. And now we're starting to come out of that a little bit, right? We're emerging. We're in the re-entry phase. And this was kind of what Sue Monk went through in her life, a time of tremendous crisis, and then a kind of re-entry phase. So for all those reasons, I thought it might make an interesting book to read at this time.
Absolutely. I've read about a third of it.
Okay.
And we'll assume, dear listeners, that you maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet. So we've got 3 different points of familiarity with it. I was very struck with the idea that, she was entering this time of crisis and really looking at her own self, her own life, her own interactions with other people, and that this was not the first time necessarily she had done this. Like she had already been going through a transformation, or at least starting the work a little bit the years prior. She was talking about different things she'd been reading, different ideas she'd been exploring. Right. So to me, I thought that was really interesting, that even though you can be working, you can still have this time of great discomfort, I would maybe say, with oneself. And I thought that was really interesting. I wonder if she was subconsciously trying to ward off she called midlife crisis a decidedly American idea, but she was kind of wary of it. I think she thought it was maybe a little bit of a cliche, and then she was fully in it, and it was like, oh, well, I guess, this is the thing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, great point about that is that, you don't have to wait around for a midlife crisis specifically to have turbulence, right, in your life. You can enter into that any old time.
Yeah, they're waiting.
Yeah, and she did say that a friend of hers, and I'm quoting now from the book, a friend of hers said to her one day, if you think God leads you only beside still waters, think again. God will also lead you beside turbulent waters. If you have the courage to enter, you'll think you're drowning, but actually you're being churned into something new.
Yeah.
And I do think that this idea actually runs a little counter to the way that many people think about church or the purpose of worship.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big part of us, for many of us, that's been trained over the years to think of worship as the nice, still, quiet place where we go to get away from the world. We get some quiet, we get a version of peace.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, we may be met by ideas and stories and music in that worship space that stir things up.
Mm-hmm.
And really make us reconsider our lives, and they can be very challenging as well as inspiring. And I think this is what Sue Monk Kidd ran into. It wasn't just, it was a new vision of a spiritual life, which as you point out, I think she'd been tasting that over off and on through the years. And now it came back with a sort of vengeance in her midlife.
Yeah, this idea that worship or spiritual life I think we assume it is there for comfort.
Yes.
And often it can be discomfort.
Yes.
Where you find those, what is it, that phrase you used before, those growing edges? Is that the phrase you use? Those opportunities for growth, right? That when we are made aware of them, or one theme she uses a lot is the idea of waiting, of sitting with yourself. And it becomes, I'm visited by a dog. Those of you on the video are watching. Friend. She's like, I love Sue Monk Kidd. She loves it. So yeah, this idea of discomfort in a place where you'd usually expect comfort is very interesting. And this idea of waiting, which is also its own kind of discomfort, especially for us Americans.
Oh my goodness, yes.
We're very good at being busy. And very good at getting things done, and very good at checking off our to-do list. And I found in the part I read that it's really this through thread of so much, air quote, gets done when you look like you're doing nothing.
Right. Yeah. There's a book that I started to read some time ago, and I've been just kind of dipping back into it from time to time. It's called The Checklist Manifesto. And I thought, oh, there's a book that speaks to my heart. I know it's a book that speaks to your heart.
I love a checklist. I do.
You love a checklist, right? And I believe the author's name is Atul Gawande. He's a physician, but he talked about the way that checklists can save our lives. And specifically, he used the example of emergency rooms across the country, the emergency rooms that tend to be the most efficient and the most responsive to patient needs are the ones that have very clear checklists, so that everyone there has a protocol that they follow. And I can really appreciate that. And I love goals and a sense of here's the thing we're moving towards. However, there is in, I would say, almost all the great religious traditions, this sense that there's another kind of growth that can only take place when you step away from the checklist and the goals. So those are valuable in their own way. However, in addition to them, there's this waiting time. Mm-hmm. And I think for Sue Monk Kidd, she experienced waiting as a not pleasant experience. And I know that right now, coming out of the pandemic, the roads are humming again, and people are getting back into that old pattern, the old swing of things. Whereas if we can find a way to summon the courage to do so, waiting could be exactly the right thing for us right now. Mm-hmm. And it's not the waiting of, I'm just going to sit back and do nothing, but there is a kind of attentiveness that's being required. What's my spirit saying to me? What's my soul saying to me? And this is really what she's trying to uncover in the course of the book. And clearly it makes her super uncomfortable, right? A good period of the time. And she was a very active person, she had a family and work and dreams and hopes and all of that. So she had a busy life, but something about that life was very unfulfilling. She uses the word stale, that it had just gone stale. And that's a word I think, I didn't hear people use that during the pandemic, but I did hear people use the word languish, that there was just something kind of an indifferent spirit. So yeah, this waiting. What is it you do when you wait? That's a really interesting, creative waiting, not just the waiting that's forced on us.
I'll admit, when I was reading this book, I think there's always a little part of my brain that if I know we're going to talk about something, I wonder, and I try to maybe anticipate what your perspective will be or what your interpretation will be with, today's life or faith or whatever. And I'll admit, with the idea of waiting, I was very much thinking, oh, well, we've kind of done the waiting, right? The pandemic was the waiting.
Yes.
The COVID was the waiting, the sitting with oneself and one's feelings to, for many of us, an uncomfortable level, a challenging level, but a very good challenge. And you surprised me with the idea that maybe waiting is still really important right now. And I love that. And I always like to be surprised. So that was very, very interesting. And I think a good challenge too, because especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I really struggled with this idea of like not having enough to do. I've always joked that I'm really bad at being bored because I don't know what to do with myself. I'm immediately miserable. And I just talk about languish. I don't know what to do with myself because I don't have a nice checklist. I'm laughing because right next to me on my desk right now is my brand new summer checklist, which is very pretty. Goodness. And it has columns.
Oh, happy days are here again.
It's great. I'm very excited about it. It's all filled out for the week. And in the beginning of the pandemic, it was the opposite of that. And especially about a year ago now, when I wasn't teaching and, I didn't have choir anymore. I miss them so much still. And, I thought the waiting was over, and this idea that there's still so much value in it.
Yeah.
And sitting and reflecting and seeing what you need and what God is calling you to and what your heart is calling you to is really interesting.
One comment I'd make about waiting to make a connection with the biblical story. After Jesus dies, the disciples are cast into their own pandemic because now they're leaderless in a sense. No matter how many times he has tried to foist that upon them, they were pretty good about resisting, taking full responsibility. And they always seem to be getting things wrong anyway. So what was the point, right? Yeah. So when he dies, there are stories that are told about how he continues to interact with them after his death. Yeah, I suppose technically they are ghost stories, right? So he's around, he's the same Jesus, but he's completely different. And in one of these stories, which is actually commemorated in the church year as Ascension Sunday, there is a Sunday given over each year, Ascension Day, to the story of Jesus really departing from the world. He sees his disciples now for the last time, so to speak. And now they're really bereft, right? It's oh my gosh, we lost him once, and now he comes back and we're losing him again. And they have a question about what they're supposed to do. And there's an angelic presence there. And the word that comes to these disciples is, wait for the promise of the Father. It's almost as if this angel is saying to them, that's how Jesus got started. He didn't do anything until he received a direction. So you folks do the same thing. And it's very interesting to me, Leslie, is that initially they go back to what they were doing before. Some of them go back to work. Some of them go to the temple and worship every day. They kind of have that, they kind of get into a routine, which fulfills some of the need to be doing something purposeful. But they leave open this part of themselves that says, I don't know exactly where we're headed, but I trust that it's going to become clear. And this is my little experiment these days, is to actually practice that in my own life. I'm thinking, I don't want to rush too quickly ahead now. I want to see where the direction is going to come. And who knows who it will come from or when or where. But I think that's what Sue Monk Kidd discovers, that she's got a great, rich life in many ways, but she's going to leave herself open through this spiritual waiting to the new thing. And that's kind of the adventure of religion. It's really putting it all out there.
Absolutely. I was curious about your feeling or your reaction. I sort of took a pause at it. She had in one of the stories, she walked past a car and the bumper sticker says, "I'll never grow up."
Mm.
And she took that very literally and was like, well, people need to always be growing.
Yeah.
And I took that differently.
How did you take that?
I took that as not losing child wonder and a sense of play.
Yeah.
Which is consistent with my personality and my approach to life. But I think, and my mother's always like, I'm never going to grow up. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Great. But that, and I think that to me, that's separate from growing.
Yes.
Well,
I like that it has two sides to it, right? And I think the side you're talking about is incredibly important, especially since Jesus said, unless you become as a child, you can't enter the kingdom of God. So in one sense, we better not grow up, right? We better have that sense that's always a part of us. But I do think they're part of what she's getting at is this notion that growth does come as an important part of spirituality. The only thing I've realized as I've thought about this over the years is that we do put a tremendous amount of emphasis in our culture in particular on growth. The company has to grow. The church has to grow. Those flowers in my backyard that I planted, they better grow. It's all around.
Right.
Unfortunately, we've been practicing a doctrine of unlimited growth for the last several hundred years, and it's wasting the planet. And so maybe it would be healthier to see growth in the way that you're talking about it, which is more of a perspective of wonder and viewing the world through the eyes of a child who are a little less goal-oriented maybe than, their adult peers, and not being so concerned about, how am I growing? Am I growing? How do I test it? How do I know?
Yeah.
Because I don't think all cultures see this the same way. I think a lot of cultures would look at us and think, yeah, because of your constant fascination with development and always reaching some new, marker, look at what's happened to the planet. So it's a really interesting question that you raised. And it's funny because it all comes from looking at a bumper sticker, right? That's what gets the whole thing started. So
yeah, that was funny. She talks a lot about this idea of a spiritual life. What does she mean by that? Do you think? Like what, I feel like that's kind of a big idea.
It's a huge idea. I get two responses to that phrase when I talk with people about it. First, it's like, what do you mean a spiritual life? Like how's that different from any other kind of life? And then there are a lot of people, on the other hand, that I talk with who are so into that and they study it and read about it so much that they're already launched, right? And I think from the perspective of Christian religion, a spiritual life is one in which we have found ourselves or have found a way to come into alignment with how the deep creative spirit of God is at work in the world. And we feel like we're really working in harmony with it rather than against it, at cross purposes. So a spiritual life in the last, many centuries, it's a life that's often fed and nourished by spiritual practices. That could be meditation or Bible reading or art or listening to music or making music. It's whatever seems to bring you into that deeper space where you can feel a sense of aliveness and purpose about the world. And I think what she means, she felt, I think, Sue Monk Kidd, that she wasn't living a spiritual life because she was so out of alignment with it. Her life was stale, it was unfulfilling. And when you use the word crisis about your life, that's kind of a heads up. And so I think that's how she's coming at it. But a spiritual life is, I think it's kind of one of those things that I treat as like a treasure trove. You want to open it up and see what's in there and kind of discover it for ourselves. And that's a great thing about her book. I think she gives us a lot of resources in this little book to figure out what we might mean when we use the phrase a spiritual life.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities there, isn't there?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so many.
Well, thank you so much for introducing this book to me. If any of our wonderful listeners out there, if you've read it or if you're planning on reading it, we'd love to hear from you. You can write a description in the a comment in the video description below. You can also email us at podcast@roundhillcommunitychurch.org. We'd love to chat with you more about it, and we can't wait to see you here again next week.
Hear, hear. Blessings to all.